if to bring more life to your life. And if you feel like your life is boring, if you do these things, well, then you're going to be alive. And some of them are pretty funny, like driving down the road and, standing up in front of the sunroof. That sounds like fun. Dangerous, but right? It sounds like fun, but that's kind of what the whole idea is. If you think your life is boring, then you need to find some things that are going to put life back into it. And because of this, we tend to focus on things of the world because these things are seen to be more tangible to us. By tangible, I mean these things are more likely to be easily accessible to us in the world, so that we will ignite our passion and our energy for our desires. Which leads people to doing things which help them feel alive. Feel like they're gaining these life experiences. But this leads people many times deeper into sin. And it leads people further in their separation from God, because the way that we live also serves a reminder for us as believers that there is something more fulfilling than just making life exciting. That we don't necessarily need to feel the pulse of energy behind something that we are doing to feel alive. We are here for more than just seeking a good thrill or getting wrapped up in the things of this world, which is pretty easy to do. As believers, we have called to be something different. We have become a new creation, as Paul pointed out in the previous verses in chapter 2 that we looked at last week. He says that we have died to sin. We have died to the flesh. And we have died with Christ. You see, the chains of sin are broken. And Paul continues to say what is truly important is not just being dead in Christ, but rather we no longer need to conform to the pattern of this world that he says in Romans 12:2. And if you haven't realized, Paul really emphasizes death to the world by pointing out that the other benefit of dying with Christ, is to live with Christ. And so this is why Paul writes, beginning of chapter 3, and he says, since then you have been raised with Christ. You have been raised with Christ. Paul reminds us that since we have also died with Christ, just as he points out in Romans 6, if we have died with Christ, then we died with him and we died to sin. Therefore, naturally, since we have died with Christ, we also live with him because of his resurrection. As Paul says in Romans 6:5 and verses 6:5 and Romans 6:8, for if we have been united with him in death like his, we will certainly also be united with him in the resurrection like his. And then in verse 8, now if we died with Christ, we believe that we will also live with him. We also live with Christ because of his resurrection. Because he lives and is seated at the right hand of God the Father, then we live as well. We have life. We have been made new creations. And because we are new creations, therefore we should set our hearts and our minds on the things above. And the reason Paul is writing this is to help us keep in mind that we need to focus on the things of heaven, to focus on the things of God, rather than the things of man, which we believe give us life. Because when we think of the things of men, we always are struggling with thinking of what we want and what we need. And because of this, we only think of ourselves. We have the things of man on our mind rather than the things of God. It is actually very easy to be trapped in this thinking. We see this with a great example from the disciple Peter. Peter was caught in the thinking of a man rather than thinking on the things of heaven. For as we see in Matthew 16, Peter confronts Jesus. Peter confronts Jesus because Jesus got done telling them in Matthew 16 that he's going to be handed over to the Pharisees and he's going to be killed. And so what does Peter do? Peter believes he's going to do the right thing by pulling Jesus to the side and rebuking him, saying, Lord, this is not so. Because he believes, he has the thinking of man, that Jesus is going to be something special to the people of Israel. That Jesus is the king. That Jesus is going to be a prominent person of influence for the people of Israel. He was going to help throw off the yoke of the Romans. These were the things of a man, and not the things of God. And so what does Jesus tell him after hearing Peter rebuked him? He says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." Why? As mentioned, Peter had on his mind, as Jesus reveals in his rebuking in Matthew 16:23, that he did not have in mind the concerns of God, but thinking of human concerns. Human concerns are just earthly things which will perish and pass away, and should no longer hold us or set our hearts and our minds upon, because they are only temporary. We need to focus on the eternal, because we have been raised with Christ and we live with him. So we are to set our minds and to think on the things above, as in heaven. It's interesting that the Greek word for set is phorenomo, which means to have understanding, to think, as in to direct one's mind, to seek for. As Paul says in Ephesians 5:17, "Therefore do not be foolish, but understand what the Lord's will is." What does it mean to direct our thinking? To understand, as Paul puts it in Ephesians 5:17, understand what the Lord's will is. And how do we set our minds to it and seek the will of God? This also goes back to what Paul's prayer is for the church in Colossae in Colossians 1:9. "Therefore, for this reason, since the day we have heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. We continually ask God to fill you with knowledge of his will through all wisdom and understanding that the Spirit gives." That we are to know and understand the will of God. These are the things that we should be setting our hearts and our minds on. So how are we supposed to do this? What is it that we are to do that helps us set our hearts and our minds on the things of God? Just turn to Philippians 4:8.